So I want to now get a little personal with that, talk about this whole issue of personal biases and how it affects what happens in the classroom. Alicia Walker is a single mother of 3 living in Amherst, Massachusetts. Her oldest child, a 9-year-old, is in public school. He is one of only a few black children in his class and is even further isolated by his classification as a special needs student.
He feels singled out at times. He feels different. Also, just in terms of his disability, he wonders why he's not like the rest of the kids, why he needs to leave. To make it like a comparative measure, we did spend a year living in Springfield at one point because that is where I work. So we did try moving there for a year, and he did go to school there for a year, and we had a completely different experience. And their school system is completely minority students, like the entire district. There were no Caucasian students in his entire school. And so he had a completely different experience there, a more feeling of inclusion, not feeling singled out in the classroom, not feeling like his behaviors were making him different than everybody else.
Can you amplify a little bit more this issue of how he's treated by the educators? I mean, how do you believe they view him, not because of some of his needs, but because of the color of his skin?
I think those things, because of the color of his skin, those things are really closely tied together. And so I think that that even if he were a white student and he had an IEP and he had some of the same challenges, it still wouldn't be the same outcome because of how he's viewed. And so I think when he has instances or behavioral issues, I think he's viewed as frightening and as a threat, and as we need to get him out of the classroom. We need to separate him from the students. We need to keep him away from the classroom. Like, these things are continuously happening. And at first I thought it was like a normal response, and that this must be the best that they can do, or this must be protocol. However, when we moved to Springfield, that was not the case. And I think that behavior and perception of behavior and just cultural competency plays a big role in how you view someone's actions. And so when he does something that appears to be a little bit more aggressive, or if he gets really upset and like pushes something, that's very alarming. And that's taken. Teachers here see that as a threat, but teachers in Springfield didn't perceive that as a threat. And I think it has a lot to do with his race and how that perception of him as a human, and then how that ties into his behaviors and how they are displayed.
Now, Jamal, you're a former student in the Boston public school system. You were talking earlier about not only having white educators, but there was a person of color who really sort of raised the bar for you. But nonetheless, most of your teachers were white. How did that impact you, and do you think it would have been different if the majority of your teachers were black?
For sure. So the parent we just heard from, Alicia, that is spot on and ties directly to what I was saying earlier. Small things that a student may have done were being interpreted as perhaps worse than they actually were, and that's something that really, really stood out. I spoke earlier about the issue being twofold. The second piece of it that I didn't get to is the fact that in a lot of communities that are low resources or low access, the only time that a child gets to see a glimpse of a world that is not their own is when they go to school. And the teacher becomes a proxy for success, for the professional world. So when you walk into a classroom, you walk into a school, and all your educators look and sound completely differently to you, and don't seem to actually have your lived experience, you start to feel, at the very least subconsciously, that you don't belong. So having teachers of color is immensely important, just so that you can see yourself there, but also, like I spoke about earlier, to have expectations match potential.
And when did you notice that? At what age did you notice that there were some of these inequities in terms of how you were treated and how your white classmates were treated?
For sure. So it wasn't so much that the difference in treatment that I noticed. It was more later on down throughout college. I remember in 2008, 2009, the economy had crashed. And we used to run out of paper and have to share textbooks in our classrooms. I remember I went to college and I met people from some suburban neighborhoods, like Concord, for instance. And I remember seeing these amateurly made pots at a friend's home. And I said, "Oh wow, did you take a weekend pottery class?" And they said, "No, this was our actual. This happened in school." And these were things, pottery, home ec, things that I didn't even know were real. I thought they were from Disney Channel. So I started to realize that, oh, I thought the economy hit us all the same. And that was a huge realization of inequity, at least in funding and access to resources.
And Bianca, to you, what about the curriculum? What is being taught in the classroom? Is that part of the problem as well?
I think it is in a lot of places, although it is changing. But, in a lot of schools, children of color don't see themselves in the curriculum. And many teachers have said through surveys, especially teachers in suburban settings, say that they don't feel comfortable or have the training, the preparation to talk directly about race. And we heard a lot of that during the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. A lot of teachers wanted to talk about it, but they felt like, they wouldn't be supported by parents or their district in doing so. And then there are other ways that children and parents receive messages that they're not okay. If they speak another language, for instance, it often happens that if they're Black, brown, or Asian, teachers might tell them or discourage them from speaking that language to their children. They don't see it as an asset, whereas white children are often encouraged to learn French or learn other languages. For them, it's okay, but for children of color, it's a liability. And so there are many different ways in which schools message that families of color are not accepted.
Right. And Gloria, is there not a distinction, though, between having a conversation about race? I mean, that's difficult, I think, for anyone, certainly for a white teacher who has no real experience in teaching it, that becomes much more difficult. But what about introducing just other conversations around people of color, right? There are ways, not necessarily dealing with race specific, but here are some people of color who have done amazing things that you may not have known about. Sort of veering from the typical curriculum to add other faces into the conversation.
So what's interesting about that, Dan, is the fact that I guess last year the Children's Cooperative Book Center here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison did a survey to look at what books are available to children. It turns out that better than 50% of the children's books that are produced have white characters. The next largest group of main characters in a book are animals. And then something like 10% of those books have Black faces, and then you go down from Latinx to Asian to American. So even having the resources is an issue for many teachers. Often, however, when teachers have that resource in their hand, they still don't know exactly what to do with it. There's a very famous book called The Watson Family Goes to Birmingham, summer 1963, and many of us are old enough to know what happened in Birmingham in the summer of 1963. So here are 4 little girls murdered in a church, and the book is a narrative about this other family from Detroit that goes to visit. I've watched young white soon-to-be teachers stay away from the murder of the children and talk all about the parenting style of the mother, of just really not comfortable taking up the real issue.
Now, just recently, I want to sort of turn to some of the politics of the moment, and President Trump, who recently weighed in on the issue of what's being taught, the curriculum that's being taught in our schools. And there's this, he was talking about wanting to get away from what he described as sort of critical race theory and restore, quote unquote, patriotic education. Jamal, I know this got your attention. What did you think about that?
This certainly got my attention, Dan, particularly because this is not, necessarily racial history. This is American history. And the important thing to note is that we need to take a deeper look into how the middle class was built in this country and how the underclass was created in this country. That has a lot to do with histories of redlining, housing discrimination, exclusive GI bills, things that actually helped other groups of people to climb the economic ladder. And when we dig into that a bit deeper, I think what we'll see is that these are pretty superficial and misleading notions of meritocracy and bootstraps. So we start to think that you just work hard and you make it where you're supposed to go. And what that creates, I think, is a lack of empathy amongst people, not just students, but students, children who become adults and feel that, well, I've gotten where I am simply because of my hard work, and everybody else who's not where I am simply did not work hard themselves. So I think we need to really dig into the education and also the economics, because these things are interrelated. So when you talk about speaking about race historically, it's not simply to rehash all the wrongs and to talk about Martin Luther King, all of which are very important. We need to talk about the actual concrete things that happen that clearly still have lasting effects economically and otherwise today.
So I'm wondering to any of you who want to jump in on this, how will this push for a patriotic education? What will the impact of something like this be, and how will it impact kids?
Well, I would just argue that it often frustrates our students, because when they show up at college and actually have to read primary documents and they see something, they're very angry that they didn't learn this. And I'm not talking about black students. I'm saying white students are, why didn't I know this? It's interesting listening to Jamal, because one of the bedrocks of the American economy is home ownership and the mortgage system. But the mortgage system is built off of slavery, that indeed, when those planters couldn't afford to buy more land, they mortgaged the slaves. So, but no one talks about this. Once again, there's this discussion of, on my own, I worked hard and I earned this. But if you've got a people who worked for 400 years for, or over 200 years for nothing, and then another almost 100 years of minimum income through the sharecropping system, and then low wage jobs, you are essentially condemning them to poverty.
I want to get someone from our audience who sent in a question. Kelly from Boston asked, Dr. Ladson, have scholars reached a point where a coordinated effort is needed to advance the importance of race and ethnicity beyond writing scholarly papers?
Well, the lane that scholars find themselves in is writing. That's kind of what we do. We don't set policy. We don't do the practice. Now, could there be a better connection between practitioners and policymakers and scholars? Indeed. But, we're almost at a place where we don't trust the people who have the information. We are actually seeing, in the midst of COVID-19, the highest quality epidemiologists being discounted, telling us, you don't know what you're talking about. So it's really hard, I think, when you are in the academy to be able to make those connections with policymakers and practitioners.
So